have had a very warm reception here in Alberta, and I'm getting the sense that Canadians are very hospitable. This is my very first time here. So I'm coming up from South Carolina, and we have our own experiences lately with disasters, and I'll bring some of that in today. But as I was researching where I was going, I learned that Alberta is not only famous for hospitality and Tim Hortons, but also you have that dubious distinction of being the Canadian disaster capital right now, which is very unfortunate. So we'll bring some of that in, but you guys have had a rough couple of years. So I won't make the mistake of coming up here and just talking to you about Katrina, like that's the only disaster that's happened. I know that a lot of this is very personal for you guys in the room. Let me just make sure all of this technology stuff is working. Oh, yep, okay, it did. All right, good. So as I'm looking through, I'm learning that that Alberta has suffered in the past 5 years 3 of the most costliest disasters in the nation's history. So topping the list with the Fort McMurray fire, in which I'm finding out that not only is it $3.6 billion worth of damage, but that 2,400 people were forced from their homes, and oil sands operations were affected, which I'm sure affected the entire province as well, right? And that it took more than 2 months before that fire was under control, officially declared under control, which is just staggering. So I thought that this quote was especially telling, that from Don Forgeron, where he said, "This wildfire and the damage that it caused is more alarming evidence that extreme weather events have increased in both frequency and severity in Canada." So I think it's important to think about why are we talking about this? You guys all know about the Fort McMurray fire. You all know firsthand more than I do about the floods in Calgary. But I think what's important here is in looking at these disasters, what sociologists like to do is look at patterns across, right? And so we look at the patterns and say, okay, what do we see happening time and time again after these disasters, and how could we analyze those patterns in a way that helps us be more prepared for next time? If we know that extreme weather events are increasing in frequency and severity, we know that there will be more events. So, so the point of this sort of analysis is thinking about what are the lessons learned. So that takes us to our second most expensive and natural catastrophic disaster in the country's history, with the floods right here in Calgary. So again, I have numbers, you guys have probably more experiences. How many of you, just by show of hands, were personally affected by this flood? Okay, good. How many of you it affected your homes in particular? Okay, good. Not good, but you know what I mean. I always like to know a little bit about who I'm talking to, and to be honest, my lecture style is much more interactive than it is sage on the stage. So if you would like to ask me questions or jump in, please do. I'll save some time for questions at the end as well, but jump in there whenever you're ready. Another good quote that I found on these floods in particular was where somebody said, "As a country, we need to take a more disciplined and sustained approach to helping prepare Canadians for fires and floods. We need to build a more resilient country to better protect those affected and the very real impacts of our changing climate." So again, this was the same person as quoted before. The point being that we can learn from these disasters, right? And then I studied those two, and then Dr. Haney tells me last night, oh, but also this one. So $700 million in insured damages, a third of the town destroyed, 2,000 people left homeless from this particular fire. And again, in paying attention to lessons learned, we see that the stronger a community is beforehand, the better they're going to do after the recovery. So one of the things that we're going to talk about today is kind of uneven recoveries, right? And so, we'll talk about the 3 phases of disaster. One being you have your emergency phase, right? Are any of you involved in the emergency responses to disasters? Okay, good. So if your emergency phase, then you have your the response phase, where you're responding to the immediate needs, and then you have your recovery phase. So what today is going to focus on really is that extended recovery phase. All right, so I told Tim I wouldn't talk too much about Katrina, but I will bring this in because in the recovery phase, the number one most pressing issue is housing, getting displaced people back in their homes. You can still hear me okay? I moved away from the mic for a second. This is something that I know a little bit about on a very personal level because of this is my home before Katrina. So this is the disaster that took my home. And as a result, I was in temporary housing for about 2 months before I was able to finally find a place to rent. And when I did find a little 2-bedroom house, I paid a very high price for that as compared to the local prices pre-storm in the area. And where we wound up locating was about an hour and a half away from our jobs, but it was the best we could find around. And so we commuted because that was the best housing that was available. So I can speak a little bit about this issue both as a researcher who studies housing discrimination and as an evacuee who's experienced displacement as well. So I can tell you a little bit about not just the numbers, but what it feels like to scramble to find a new place to live. What strategies people employed, what strategies I employed to try to get the best place I could find. What people in surrounding communities said to me about poorer than me evacuees, or about Black evacuees, and what that meant to their access to housing. And so, again, housing, inequality, disasters, all of that kind of comes together here. So here's what I want to talk to you about today. So I mentioned the title of my book is Rethinking Disaster Recovery, and there's a couple of things that I'd like to encourage you to rethink today when you're thinking about housing and disaster recovery. We often think about the impact on housing as the number of damaged homes. And number of damaged homes is certainly important, right? That's the most direct impact, but there's a lot of indirect impacts as well. So the impact on housing after recovery is also about limited access to even undamaged homes. It's also about displacement that occurs from rising housing costs. And it's also about the increased potential for housing discrimination following an event, a catastrophic event. So when I say rethinking disaster recovery, that means paying attention to various social vulnerabilities that make it more difficult for people in some categories than others to bounce back after a storm. So a couple of key concepts we're going to talk about are social vulnerability and resilience, that bouncing back idea. Any questions so far? Okay. So this is after the Fort McMurray fire, right? And like I said, we immediately think about the damaged homes or destroyed homes after a disaster, but we don't often consider when people are kept out of their undamaged homes by government entities. And so, so you'll remember that after the Fort McMurray fire, there were bans from returning back to various neighborhoods, so that many residents were kept out for more than a month, even if their home wasn't damaged by the fire, because of what? Does anybody know? That's right, exactly, because of unsafe toxic levels. So in certain neighborhoods, Abasand, am I saying that right? Yeah? Abasand, Waterways, and Beacon Hill, in those neighborhoods, residents were kept out due to those unsafe toxins. And so the same was true in New Orleans following Katrina, that there were nearly 1 million displaced residents just in that city. Certainly there were a lot more in the 4 states that were affected, but just in that city, they had to wait more than a month to be allowed back in, while this city that's laying below sea level struggles to pump all the water out. They're trying to get it out, and they can't let people back in. It's not safe, it's not clean to be able to let people back in until then. So even for those homes that didn't suffer flood damage, those residents were still displaced. So it's still an impact on housing. There's still problems associated with that. Additionally, unimpacted houses that were affected had to do with public housing, right? So public housing was undamaged largely after the storm, but housing officials in the area decided that public housing had been a problem for a while, and they thought of Katrina as a good opportunity to redesign public housing, and so they raised the undestroyed housing units as well, which means people whose homes weren't damaged still lost their homes, right? And those people were permanently displaced. They rebuilt some public housing, but not to the same level, not the same numbers that they had before. So a lot of people did not get a replacement unit. So what this means is that even if your home is undamaged following a disaster, you may still have to deal with the environmental impacts that affect your home from the disaster, like with the Fort McMurray fire, or you might have to deal with the bureaucratic impacts of recovery plans that affect your home or neighborhood, right? Larger entities than you might decide this neighborhood is not worth rebuilding, or this neighborhood is better redesigned as a park. This neighborhood has seen too many floods, and it's a bad idea for us to invest in rebuilding it. So even if your home is not damaged, there might still be housing impacts. Another important thing to consider is the impact on housing prices. Okay, and so I did a little bit of internet research with some help from you guys here, but found that that what I was seeing here in Calgary kind of fit the traditional pattern that we see usually following a disaster, which is that when we're talking about owner-occupied dwellings, that the typical pattern is that initially following a disaster, housing prices decrease, right? Housing values decrease. What that means is that because housing prices are suppressed in damaged areas, demand is lower, right? People don't want to move into areas that are damaged or recovering, and so you can get a good deal. And so oftentimes opportunists or profiteers will swoop in to buy and then fix up and flip, or buy and then rent a property. But once the recovery process nears completion, housing prices are often much higher than they were pre-disaster. And so not only are the housing prices higher, but usually the taxes are higher, and insurance costs wind up being higher as well, right? Because now you're at a higher risk. So all of that together, higher housing prices, higher taxes, higher insurance, also means rents are going to go up. All of that can combine to cause displacement for low-income residents, right? Can push people out of their homes. If you own your own home, then all of a sudden the taxes might become unaffordable for you. The cost of rebuilding certainly might become unaffordable for you, and then previous residents wind up getting pushed out, and new opportunists come in and buy at the low prices, and then fix up and benefit from the price increases. So that's kind of the typical pattern with homeowner-occupied dwellings. Does that fit with some of your experiences here? Okay, I'm seeing some nods. All right, good. When we talk about renting, We also see some displacement, typically. So the impact can be even more severe for renters. We know that moderate to low income folks are more likely to rent. They do typically rent. And rental prices do typically increase following a disaster, just like prices for anything that's scarce, right? So did any of you experience any price gouging following the floods or hear about any of that? Some yes, some no. Certainly that's illegal. Here in Canada, you're not allowed to do that, but it doesn't mean people don't still try. I was reading some reports about a bag of ice going for $20, or somebody having to buy all of their, they wanted to buy a case of water, but they sold them individually, so they wound up paying $48 for 24 bottles of water, that sort of thing. And so we often think of it in terms of goods, right? Water, ice, food, that sort of thing, or maybe even services. But certainly it can also apply and does apply to rents as well. And this has a very profound impact. So rents, this is important because the Emergency Management Act makes it illegal to price, this is here in Canada, right? Makes it illegal to price gouge following a disaster during the local state of emergency. However, rent prices don't go up during the state of emergency. Rent prices go up during the recovery period. So that's when this gouging is really happening, and that's not protected, right? So what we found during Katrina, I wound up doing a study. I was studying housing discrimination anyway, pre-Katrina, and so I found myself in the unusual position of having pre- and post-Katrina data on housing. And so I knew a lot about what the average rent was. I knew a lot about how often discrimination happened, that sort of thing, in those areas before the storm. And you're gonna laugh at how low the rents were, but they were pretty low. So pre-storm, this is southern Mississippi. Pre-storm in southern Mississippi, we have rents of $485. 6 months after the storm, it's more than doubled, right? 9 months after the storm, still high, still more than double. And so when we think about, again, how does this apply to other disasters? Well, in the first couple of months following a major catastrophic event, virtually nobody is able to rent because there's just nothing available, right? People live in shelters, they live in tents, they live with families, they live in temporary housing. But after a couple of months, typically what happens is people start to settle in somewhere. After 6 months in Mississippi, people had started to do enough rebuilding that rental properties started coming back online. Now, demand is still super high. We have any economists here? Super high demand, super low supply. Super high demand, low supply means high prices. That's what's going to happen. And that's what we saw afterwards. And then 9 months later, it's still the same pattern. It's a several years process for these things to happen. And then in some cases, what winds up happening is the whole community winds up gentrifying, right? The whole community winds up getting a facelift, essentially. And because the whole community has gotten a facelift, housing prices stay high and the rental prices stay high, which is great if you're a landlord, but terrible for you if you are a low or moderate income family. Also, with that research, I can say that following a disaster, theories would predict, neoclassical economic theories would predict that housing discrimination is much more likely following a disaster, right? It's more likely because of that very low supply, very high demand. Essentially, your landlords following a disaster are able to pick and choose their most ideal tenant, right? And that means that any prejudices or preferences that they might have could come into play there. They also are able to, they don't even really have to advertise an available property because they have a unique commodity. They can just advertise it to their social networks. And even if there was no prejudice or preferences, because you're advertising your social networks, and our social networks tend to be homogenous, meaning we tend to hang out with people like ourselves, because of that, then you're gonna likely reinforce some inequality there, right? So if the majority of landlords are, for example, white and middle class, then the people that hear about those available properties are going to be white and middle class. They're going to get first dibs on those properties. We know then that housing discrimination in this sort of high demand, low supply setting would be more likely. However, I conducted some research on that following Katrina. Would you be surprised to know that I did not find more housing discrimination? I was. I was very surprised. Why? The reason is it's virtually indetectable following a disaster. Let me explain that a little bit. The way that we detect housing discrimination is, certainly it's very difficult to know if you've been discriminated against. In today's day and age, people discriminate. People don't say, hey, I'm not renting to you because I don't like people with kids, right? They don't say that outright. They'll smile and nod and tell you about the place and then just not call you back, right? So it's usually very covert. There's not signs saying these people need not apply in the window. It's much more covert. So you can suspect discrimination, but it's very difficult to detect. The way it's detected is usually someone suspects something is going on. They call a regulatory agency in the US that they call fair housing agencies. The fair housing agency could investigate, right? And they will send, they do what's called audit testing, and they'll send people with matched characteristics except for the one thing they're testing for. So let's say it's gender, for example. They'll send a man and a woman who are virtually the same in every other way to go try to rent a place and then compare their treatment, right? Compare the information that they find out, how much they're quoted, whether or not they get the place, et cetera. And so that kind of quasi-experimental design is really the only way that we have of testing for discrimination. But in a tight housing market, everything's moving like this. It is virtually impossible to employ that audit design, right? Because well, I could read to you my experience from the book, but essentially an available apartment will come online. It will be advertised that morning in the paper. This for me was 9 months after the disaster. Available apartment is advertised at 8 in the morning. You get there at 9 o'clock, it's already gone, right? And so if you're fortunate enough to get something, you can't really tell if the reason that they gave it to this person was because they were first or because of discrimination. It becomes virtually impossible. Also, interactions are standardized. So landlords, whereas they would have kind of tried to woo and court potential renters earlier, tell them all about the place, show them, offer them some rental incentives, $100 off your first month's rent, that sort of thing. If you sign today, think of your car salesmen that are trying to lure you in. They had to kind of go through all of that before. Now, in a post-disaster context, they often just turn on a voice recording that says, this is the available information on the place, this is where it is if you want to drive by and pick up an application, and then that's it, right? So everything's standardized. So it's very difficult to pick up any discrimination. But theory would suggest that it is through the roof because of supply and demand. The third problem here is that it is less likely to be regulated following a disaster. Number one, people are too busy dealing with everyday junk to file complaints, housing discrimination complaints, right? They have other more pressing issues following a disaster. Number two, those agencies that are in charge of making sure discrimination is not occurring are also affected by the catastrophe. So those agencies are often closed. Their employees are often dealing with displacement themselves. Their files may be flooded. Their computer systems may be down. Following Katrina, the fair housing agencies were offline for several months, right, at a time when housing discrimination was likely through the roof. And so this is something that I don't think that we're paying very much attention to in thinking about what are some of the impacts on housing. Because essentially, housing agents have free rein here at this point. So I want to talk for just a minute about social vulnerability and what that is. When we're talking about discrimination, I was talking about in the US, the classes that are protected, and arguably there should be more protected classes, but the classes that are protected are gender, familial status, race, color. They actually separate race and color, which is interesting. I can tell you about that another time. Religion, disability, national origin. I knew there were 7. So those are the protected classes. So those tend to be some of the more socially vulnerable groups. We discovered during Hurricane Katrina, certainly, that hurricanes are not equal opportunity disasters. They hurt low-income residents more because those residents often lacked jobs, they often lacked insurance, they often lacked other portable resources to transfer other places, to recover, and to start over. And so, so what we have to do then is to really think long and hard about how do we address those segments of society that don't have the capacity to adequately respond to or recover from disasters. And then how do we do that? So how do we target resources to help people in what we know from disaster after disaster to be socially vulnerable groups? We're talking about our elderly populations, our disabled populations, immigrant populations, limited English speaking populations, racial and ethnic minorities, women, people with dependent populations, so people who are taking care of elderly or children under age 5, for example. How do we prioritize those folks in targeting resources? So that brings me to back home in my circle of the map. So it brings me to the South Carolina floods. I don't know if you heard about these all the way up here. They were not as severe as your Calgary floods, but they were very impactful for us. The estimated damage was about $900 million. And this impacted both cities and, importantly, rural areas. And that's interesting because a lot of the disaster literature doesn't speak to what goes on in rural areas and how housing might be different in those areas. We're not talking about big public housing units here. We're talking about mobile homes, things like that. So what was interesting was after FEMA comes in and provides their aid. Now FEMA is responsible for helping folks get back up to basic levels of safety and sanitation, right? But not necessarily meeting all of the needs or covering all of the damage. We do have national flood insurance for that, but national flood insurance is only required if you have a mortgage, because usually the bank requires you to carry it if you live in a flood zone and you have a mortgage. So if you lived in a house that was deeded down, meaning your parents or your grandparents paid that mortgage off and you own that house, you don't have to carry flood insurance, and a lot of people don't because it's expensive. So only about 4% of the folks in South Carolina had flood insurance. What was interesting is you have your FEMA money, you have your flood money, but there's still a big gap in unmet needs. So the Housing and Urban Development Agency gave, how much did I say? Does it say on there? Yeah, about $100 million Sounds like a lot. But if the damage is $900 million, they gave $100 million to the state to address that unmet need. So now the state has got to decide, all right, how do I apportion this? How do I make the most of this? How do I get the best bang for my buck? So just to give you a little bit of background on the flood, this is October 2015. So a year ago, South Carolina receives unprecedented and historical rainfall. It's going to sound very familiar, unfortunately. That heavy rainfall amassed to about 20 inches across the state, and it came from a hurricane, from Hurricane Joaquin, and rainfall that just lingered afterwards. And so the floods caused loss of life. It caused extensive damages to dams, bridges, roads, homes, businesses. So more than 33,100 homes were affected. A lot of them, like I said, in rural areas. And we only have about 4% of the state with flood insurance. So the question is, how does the state government then determine where to spend that money and in order to maximize the impact? So this is what they did. I don't know if you can see that, but I'm going to tell you about it in case you can't. So the state partnered with, because I think it's really interesting in learning about how can we make the biggest bang for our buck while also paying attention, rethinking recovery in a way that pays attention to these socially vulnerable groups. So the state partners with the University of South Carolina's Hazard and Vulnerability Research Institute to identify those areas that were, one, most impacted, and two, most vulnerable. And they overlaid those two things onto a map. So the Institute had come up with this social vulnerability index that informed this process by empirically delineating the most vulnerable census tracts with the FEMA data. So it puts both of those things together. And so residents in high vulnerability areas, they said this is important to do because residents in high vulnerability areas have a lower ability to adequately prepare for, respond to, and rebound from the environmental impacts such as floods. So this geographic overlay targets the resources to the most heavily impacted and vulnerable areas, and arguably this yields the highest benefit because those areas are much less able to bounce back without assistance. So you might say, well, aren't all disasters kind of equal opportunity disasters? Certainly if you live in a fancy house, and in fact I heard there were quite a few fancy houses here in this area that were flooded. It's going to flood a fancy house, same as it's going to flood a not fancy house, right? But the ability of the residents to recover from that, to absorb those losses, is very different by social category, and this recognizes those things. So it made what they called hotspots. So areas that are both heavily impacted, overlaid with social vulnerability indices. What do I mean when I say socially vulnerable? In this area, this highly impacted area, the ones that are purple are the ones that the deep purple are the ones that they said we're going to target our monies towards those areas because they are both highly impacted and socially vulnerable. The residents in these areas had a higher percentage of being over age 65. They were much less likely to have a bachelor's degree. They had a higher percentage of disabilities. They had a higher percentage of individuals without health insurance. In addition, the African American population in this area was much higher. It was 40% as compared to 27% statewide. The median household income was $39,000 a year as opposed to $45,000 for the state as a whole. The per capita income was lower. The persons living in poverty was higher. And so this is a new thing. This is a kind of a cutting edge approach that they were taking to the disaster recovery process by assessing social vulnerability as part of the recovery strategy. And so this is kind of the summary of where we've gone so far. Are hurricanes, floods, and fires equal opportunity disasters? No, they're not. They can affect people at all different social levels, but the way that people prepare for them are different by social category, and the way that the response and the recovery are uneven as well. How does social vulnerability impact disasters? The people in these socially vulnerable areas have a lower capacity to be able to bounce back without outside assistance. And then hopefully, in thinking about this, this most recent disaster in South Carolina, we can think about, well, how can we use that information? How can we take that and move forward so that we are able to respond in the most effective way? I can guarantee you that following Hurricane Matthew, which just hit this past week, that they're going to use the same process again. It's been working very well. Let me go ahead and move to some of your questions or experiences that you've had that maybe resonate with some of this stuff, or something that doesn't fit, if that's pertinent as well. What questions do you have? Yes, ma'am.
So how long did it take for the state to compile the data on social media that would relate to start finding funds?
It's a good question. So this report came out in May of this year. So the floods were in October. The report came out in May, and so in May they said this is how we're going to use these funds. So a little less than a year. I would argue that the data, the social vulnerability data and the indices were already ready to go. I think a lot of what we're waiting for was FEMA data to know what were the most heavily impacted areas, to be able to put both of those together. Because the reason I say that is because the social vulnerability index would have been based on census data that was already available. So it wouldn't have taken long to put those together into an analysis. Yes?
I don't know if it's been studied, but is there any data to indicate that the discrimination happens within government organizations or other organizations, charities, that sort of thing? Has there been a study? Does it indicate that?
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, there were some complaints filed, some court cases filed following Hurricane Ike in Texas and Hurricane Dolly in Texas also, where the Fair Housing Organization alleged that FEMA was discriminating against low-income families because they more often denied I'm trying to think of the exact wording that was used, but they more often denied the repair request or the damage claim. And the reason that they denied it was I wish I had the wording right in front of me, but what they called, I don't know the exact term, I'm sorry, but the reason they denied it was because they said these homes were already in poor condition prior to this event. Therefore, we can't guarantee that this was caused by the event, right? It was not, it was deferred maintenance, that's what it was called. It was deferred maintenance, and that puts the onus on the homeowner, right? Therefore, we're not responsible. And obviously those deferred maintenance issues affected low-income families a lot more than it would other people. So there were whole areas, and they could look at those large patterns, there were whole areas of the state that were denied very frequently because of deferred maintenance, and those were low-income areas. Good question.
You just described the process there. It's very. I'm asking about the Hurricane Matthew or even the Tulane fires. Are you able to, or do you have means of basically watching how that plays out and documenting that so you can display with the government and force change or something?
Sure. Yeah, and certainly groups like Tim's Research Center here, research centers all over the U.S. and I'm sure Canada will be paying close attention to how people get aid and how it plays out, yeah, there'll be lots of reports, but usually I would say it's difficult to really have any good sense of the impact and the response and recovery until you have a little distance.
Do you have like maybe
So it'll take time.
groups that you're actively working with?
No, not yet. Hurricane Matthew was just last week, so people are interested, but nobody's doing anything yet. But with Fort McMurray, I would imagine there's probably, like Tim said, there were already some projects underway to study. But not on housing? Interesting. Yeah.
When you have the hurricane and I was interested when you were talking about housing discrimination and thinking about cities that have housing shortages.
Yeah.
Does the discrimination show up sometimes in the propensity of those with housing to exploit the situation by asking people for key money and other bonuses that would exclude certain groups because they simply don't have the money to pay it? Went on and on.
You're saying to pay up front?
No, for example, you would, one of the things in Toronto that had a really great shortage of housing, or in wartime, the same thing, is you would say to the person, yeah, you can rent it, but the key cost you another $1,000 to come in.
Yeah, so that is actually very similar to what I was finding in Mississippi. It wasn't that they were denying people flat out, right? And people will say, money is money. I'll take it if you're going to pay the rent. But often, preferred homeowners were offered certain rental incentives, or they didn't have to jump through as many hoops, like you were saying. So, for example, they would require background checks, criminal background checks, or credit checks. And those things would cost $100 or $100 here, $50 there to do those things, but they would require them of some folks and not of others, right? Of some groups and not of others. And so, or they would require a very large deposit. So even though the rent was manageable, if you required a very large deposit, then that excluded a lot of low-income families. Even if they didn't require that, arguably the strategy for a lot of folks when you're desperate to find housing is, I'm going to offer that, right? So it sounds shameful now, but my husband and I offered 6 months rent up front to get the house that we wanted because it was moving like that. Like I said, we went to we would call on a house that was listed at 8 in the morning and it would already be gone. And so when we found one we liked, we said, okay, the rent is $800 a month. I'll give you 6 months rent right now, and as long as I can have it, right? And that, even if it's not initiated by the landlord, that edges out those other folks, right? Sure.
I'm wondering if you, in your book, you look at Naomi Klein's study of the shock doctrine, because she also looked at Katrina and how that was an opportunity for corporate and political elites to privatize school, which would be related to this housing issue, especially the public housing issue. If there was a similar trend of taking it out of public hands, putting it in private hands, which obviously would impact the socially vulnerable.
Yeah, absolutely. And I didn't look at her study in particular, but yes, I do know about the privatization of schools following Katrina, and we do have a chapter on that and on how that impacted youth in the area. So I'll look into that one. Thank you. But yeah, that was a trend in post-disaster recovery in New Orleans generally, was privatization. So public housing was destroyed, public hospitals were eliminated, and public schools were eliminated. So we moved towards charter schools, privatized hospitals, and mixed income housing, which sounds like a good idea on the surface, but only if the number of units is adequate for the population, which oftentimes it's not.
So in your work, would you explore the frustration of beneficiaries or people that need help by bureaucracy and systemic issues? Did you?
No, but I love that idea. We should explore that.
I'm not ever doing a PhD. So the patients are the amount of days left of my life to do that.
Yes.
Yeah, no, I'm just
No, I did not, but yes, there, and certainly with regards to housing, that was a common theme, right? As people tried to access the, you have a million different types of grants or different types of monies or funds that are available, but you have to jump through so many hoops to get to them that a lot of people just gave up and didn't do it. And sometimes you wonder if that's by design, that if we make people jump through enough hoops, they will give up, and then we don't have to deal with such a flood of people. But yeah, it's certainly something that was an issue with the FEMA monies, for example. You had to prove that you had to prove your residence. All well and good, unless your home was completely destroyed and you didn't happen to take out your most important documents with you. Maybe you did, maybe you didn't. If you stayed and you wound up being one of those people on the roof who got rescued, you probably didn't go back in for your documents. Or you had to have marriage licenses in some cases. Well, people would say you could just go to the courthouse and get that. You couldn't, because guess what? The courthouse records were flooded too, right? And so there were a lot of bureaucratic barriers to people getting assistance. I didn't look at that in particular, but it was a common theme that came up. Yeah.
Is there a percentage that's tracked of how many people permanently emigrate from an area affected by a disaster because of lack of affordable housing or schools being privatized, for example, that sort of thing?
Yeah, definitely, and that's why I say it's good to, in looking at the overall recovery process, it's good to have a little distance. So with this book, we waited 10 years to do the retrospective, to say, all right, what do we know now that 10 years, because if you wait 6 months, you're not going to capture everybody who's coming back or who's not coming back, even a year or 2 years. But after 10 years, you figure people are pretty well settled. So you can look at data to see, there's FEMA data as to where people were making claims, so you can see where people were displaced to, and then there is a lot of tracking on whether or not they come back. Sometimes that's at the individual level. Sometimes that's done at the city level, where the city just can look at demographics and say, okay, what did the demographics of the city look like now versus just before this disaster? And so oftentimes, you'll find a city is whiter or more affluent following a disaster. In the immediate aftermath, oftentimes it is older because families don't come back right away. It's too hard. Schools are not back online. It's not a good place for kids, right? So the average age is higher, but then eventually, 10 years later, you can start to look at that and say, now that the dust has settled a little bit, where do we stand? What percentage of the population is coming back, and how is the city different? And that's a lot of what this book did, yeah. And I imagine we'll be able to do that with, High River, with Fort McMurray, with this area too, is look and see how are things different. And so I mentioned those more recent disasters because they're what's relevant right now. But as far as understanding recovery, they're really just starting those phases. So it'll be a little bit of time before we know.
My question about the NGOs involved, did you examine or explore any of the NGOs directly or indirectly as to whether or not they were discriminatory towards the immediate disaster or in the years intervening?
Yeah, there were cases of that, right? I didn't have a specific project on that, but there were, for example, there was some discrimination post-Katrina by the Red Cross, wherein there were a fair number of Latinos living on the coast before the storm, but they often weren't counted in census data. And so it was assumed that anyone who was Latino and in the Gulf Coast was there to rebuild, right? They were migrant workers who would come in to help clean up after the disaster, and therefore they were not original residents. So the shelters, the Red Cross shelters, profiled those folks and would pull them out of the shelters and tell them they had to provide proof of residency from before the storm to be able to stay at the shelter. Well, most people didn't have proof of residency, and so a lot of people that were original residents had to leave the shelter and were not able to access those resources. So that's one example. One thing that was interesting in thinking about those organizations, because sociologists, we tend to be really negative, and I focus on social inequality and all the bad stuff, right? I do have some stuff in here about the kindness of strangers and how people responded, and that's very heartwarming as well. You can use some of the social vulnerability data also if you are a nonprofit to target your aid. So like I said, that data is available almost right away because it's based on previously collected data. And so they can use those indices, and they did in the 2015 South Carolina floods to figure out, all right, which communities do we need to go to first? Which ones are going to be least likely to bounce back? And oftentimes what we found is that those organizations are able to respond faster and more efficiently than some of the larger bureaucratic government-run organizations. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, very well.
Okay, good.
Is there oftentimes a large gap between, say, census data and the actual numbers, like, say, illegal immigrants, where you might have 10 relatives living in the home and declared 4, sort of thing? Was that seen in a lot of these disasters where there's a big gap between the official and the unofficial country numbers?
I think particularly in the case of undocumented immigrants, right? Typically, census data is pretty reliable, but there are certain populations that we know it undercounts. We know it's undercounting homeless populations. We know it's undercounting undocumented populations, because often those folks are, as good as the census enumerators try to be, often those folks don't want to be found, right? And they're intentionally flying under the radar. And so, but there are ways that immigration researchers, for example, have come up with formulas and calculuses that kind of correct for that, where they can say, all right, if we know that the official number is this, then based on what we know about undocumented immigration, the actual population is probably closer to this. So there are ways we can estimate it, if not exactly. Other questions? Good. Well, I think that there's a lot of food that Tim wants us to eat. I've heard we're supposed to eat food, and I would love to talk to you more about it one-on-one. So sometimes people don't want to ask in a large forum like this, but I'll be hanging out over here. So please come over and say hello.
And I'd also like to say thank you to Dr. Haubert for coming all the way up here after having a disaster at home herself last week. So we're really grateful for her wonderful talk, and please eat more on the way up. Thank you all so much for